Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Ooh. Come on. Great to be back. Had a wonderful screening in Aspen, Colorado. Just got back this morning. I've never been to Aspen before. Very ritzy, but it's also like just a very cute small town, small mountain town in Colorado. Enjoyed it. Was killing me. I am a skier, but did not do any skiing. But so glad to be back in LA and learning with you. Who's in the house? Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehuda in South Carolina, Bill in Missouri, Bella in Florida, Paula in the Great Northwest, Joe in the Inland Empire, Melissa in Great Neck, Bell in Texas, Gail in Kansas, Lucy in Minnesota, Guy in Ohio, Shandor in the Bronx, Lorraine in Texas, Sharon in New Jersey, Nancy in North Carolina, Renee in Indiana, Aoife in Florida, Ella in Southern California. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 86 here in Tractate Sanhedrin, the 24th volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 3 in chapter 10. Picking this up right near the top of page 86a. Generally, this chapter 10, we've been wrapping up the various prohibitions and penalties which lead to a death penalty. And this is the fourth of the Torah, the court-ordered death penalties that are specified in the Torah. And this is strangulation, and which are the crimes to which that applies. And so the Mishnah taught that there is a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, right, and the majority, with regard to the liability of one who abducts his son. Right? And so we saw that it is a death penalty offense to kidnap, but it's a very specific kind of kidnapping, right? The overall context is that the rabbis are very reticent to find any situation where a court will order the death penalty. So sometimes it sounds like, oh my God, somebody just did something terrible, and the rabbis say he's exempt. Doesn't mean he's exempt from punishment, doesn't mean he's exempt from liability, certainly at the hands of the heavenly court, before which we'll all have to make an accounting. Doesn't mean that the person won't be ostracized, excommunicated, punished in some other way. Exempt in this context means, are we going to apply a death penalty? Now, for kidnapping, right, which doesn't result in a death, it's not a murder. Why is kidnapping a death penalty offense? It's, if all the elements are met. And we've already discussed, kidnapping, that is a death penalty offense from a rabbinic court, according to Torah law, this would be a Jew, who abducts another Jew, forces him to do work for him, some kind of slave labor, and then sells this person as a slave to someone else. That's pretty bad. That's basically human trafficking, isn't it? And that would be the death penalty offense. Okay, so what if the one who this person abducts is his son? Strange case. Now, what's going to be the issue here is that, well, if you're abducting your son, how are you abducting him? Isn't he already in your possession, so to speak? He's within your domain. Now, I assume that means a minor, right? So if a father kidnaps his adult son, enslaves him, and then sells him, it still might not qualify, because technically the relationship of a father and son might, sort of cancel the elements as the rabbis have laid them out. That's what they're going to talk about here. So there was a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis with regard to the liability of one who abducts his son. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason for the opinion of the rabbis who deem him exempt if he kidnaps his son? or abducts his son. So Abaye said it is derived from the verse that states, if a man shall be found abducting a person of his brethren, Deuteronomy 24:7. And this is to exclude one who is already found in the custody of the abductor before the abduction. Since the son is already in the custody of his father, the father is not liable for abducting him, even if he enslaves and sells him. We don't like it. It's not moral. It doesn't sound good at all, but it doesn't meet the requirements for this death penalty offense. Rav Papa said to Abaye, if that is so, then this idea that somebody who's already in your custody changes the elements of the crime, well, then let's look at a related issue. So Rav Papa said to Abaye, if that is so, then the verse, if a man shall be found lying with a woman, married to a husband, then they shall both of them die. Deuteronomy 22:22. Okay, that's the basic prohibition and penalty for adultery. But this could also then be interpreted, if a man shall be found, right? If a man shall be found committing adultery, well, meaning he shall be found. What if he's sort of already been committing adultery? That's the problem, in the way that a son is already in the custody of his father. So if a man shall be found, this would exclude one who was already found. And so too, would one say that adulterers are exempt from liability if they commit adultery in, for example, the house of Plony, right? Plony is, see how we're translating, the word is Plony. We translate it as so-and-so, like Ben Plony, the son of so-and-so. And when the Gemara says Ben Plony, they're talking about just, some random guy, or there's a reason to substitute Ben Plony, the son of so-and-so, as a euphemism for somebody that people, within this context, in this community, would understand who's being talked about, but they don't want to name him explicitly in order to avoid committing lashon hara, gossip, slander, evil speech. So here what they're saying is, would we say that, so therefore would adulterers be exempt if they commit adultery, for example, in the house of so-and-so, where it was well known in this community that married women are commonly found and they have a pre-existing reputation for licentiousness, right? So somewhere, where these laws were being argued about by the sages, there were some very disreputable people who were married and fornicating and committing adultery on a regular basis. So if they're already kind of committing it on a regular basis, would we say, well, then therefore they're not being found in that situation? They're already in it. And therefore the laws against adultery would not apply to them? That's the question being asked. So Abaye said to Rav Papa, the rabbi's opinion is derived from the phrase, or if he is found in his possession, he shall be put to death at Exodus 21:16, from which I am saying my inference, that it is derived if he is found to the exclusion of one who was already found. Rava said, therefore, with regard to those teachers of children, Dardeke, and those who recite Mishnayos to Torah scholars, the status of their students is as though they are found in their possession, and the teachers are exempt from liability for abducting them. And in a sense, even if you look at kind of the common law definitions of kidnapping here in America, right? It's like where you can be guilty of kidnapping if you make it, if you restrict somebody's movement. Are you really going to be arrested for that? Probably not. But to meet the requirements of the crime of kidnapping, if you make it so that somebody can't leave where they are, if you exert authority over them unlawfully, then you could be guilty of kidnapping. Well, here for court-imposed death penalty for abduction, which also requires exploitation and selling. But for that first part, abduction, if the person is already under your authority, then you will not have met the requirements for the first part of the crime. You didn't abduct them because they're already in your authority. And that would be the case for a teacher, for example. Now, the Mishnah taught that there is a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis with regard to liability if one abducted a person who is half slave and half free, which would happen if a slave, a Canaanite slave, was owned by two Jewish owners, and then one of them set him free. So then this person is half slave and half free. And this is not a Jewish slave, this is a Canaanite slave. So we learned in a Mishna there in Bava Kama 87a that Rabbi Yehuda says there is no indemnity for the humiliation of a slave since he is not a full-fledged Jew. But he's a Canaanite. Why would you call him any fledged Jew? And the reason is a non-Jew who became a slave of a Jew, this hasn't existed for thousands of years, but when it existed, a Canaanite slave would be brought into the home of a Jewish family. He wouldn't become a Jew, but he would be somewhat Jewish in the sense that he would be obligated in the same commandments as a Jewish woman. Not lighting candles, of course, but other commandments that Jewish women are obligated in. And the reason that the Canaanite slave who lives in a Jewish home, and that's why he's obligated in these things like eating kosher food, but other kinds of things like praying 3 times a day, he's not obligated in because, like a Jewish woman who in the traditional home 2,000 years ago was, it was strictly the role of the women to raise the children, and therefore women didn't have control over their time, and that's why they're not obligated in time-bound positive commandments like praying 3 times a day. It's admirable if women do that, if they pray 3 times a day, but they're not obligated. Likewise, the Canaanite slave doesn't have control of his time because he's a slave. But because he's a Canaanite slave in a Jewish home, he is obligated in some of the commandments. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that a Canaanite slave is not a full-fledged Jew and therefore damages for humiliation in some kind of a tort case that included humiliation? That is a law that regulates torts and other kinds of damages between Jews in a rabbinic court. We would go to other courts for problems between Jews and non-Jews or between non-Jews and non-Jews. So the point is that he doesn't consider the Canaanite slave to be regulated by that body of law because he's not a full-fledged Jew. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? It is derived from the verse that states, when men struggle together, a man and his brother, and the wife of the one drew near to deliver her husband from the hand of the other one who smites him, and she extended her hand and grabbed his private parts. Deuteronomy 25:11. Now this is all about when two guys are in a fight. A woman the wife, probably one of them, tried to get involved. She hurt him, or she ended up getting hurt. It's all about the laws of physical damages when somebody gets hit, and what kinds of damages need to be paid: medical costs, loss of labor, humiliation, etc. Now, this is the source for liability to pay restitution for humiliating another person. And from the term his brother, it is derived that one who has brotherhood, i.e. who is halakhically related to his biological family, receives payment for humiliation. And a slave is excluded, a Canaanite slave, as he has no brotherhood, i.e. he is not halakhically related to the family that owns him as a Canaanite slave. He is not their fellow Jew. And what is the reason for the opinion of the rabbis who say that that one who abducts a slave who is half free and half slave would be liable? Right? What is the reason for the opinion of the rabbis? Well, they hold that although the slave has no family ties, nevertheless, he is the brother of the assailant who abducts him with regard to the fulfillment of mitzvahs. As a Canaanite slave is obligated to fulfill the same mitzvahs, the same commandments that a Jewish woman is obligated to fulfill. Now the Gemara asks, and here with regard to abduction, how does Rabbi Yehuda interpret the verses and arrive at the conclusion that one is liable for abducting one who is half free and half slave? And I guess the rabbis disagree with that. They find him exempt. I had it wrong. Now, shouldn't the term from his brethren render exempt from liability one who abducts a slave? And the Gemara answers that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the term in the verse, from his brethren, serves to exclude from liability one who abducts slaves. Had the verse continued, the children of Israel, that phrase would have been interpreted to exclude from liability one who abducts one who is half slave and half free. Since the verse states, from the children of Israel, the prefix mem, the letter mem, meaning from, indicates that there are some from the children of Israel for whose abduction one is liable, and there are some for whose abduction one is exempt. So that prefix also serves to exclude from liability one who abducts a person who is half slave and half free. Therefore, this is an example of a restriction following a restriction, and there is a hermeneutical principle that a restriction following a restriction serves only to amplify the law and to include in the category someone else. And who is that? Somebody who abducts a person who is half slave and half free. And the rabbis who deem one who abducts a person who is half slave and half free exempt from the death penalty for abduction, how do they interpret the verse? They do not exclude slaves based on the term from his brethren, as the slave is the brother of the abductor with regard to the fulfillment of mitzvahs. But concerning the expression children of Israel and the more expanded expression from the children of Israel, one serves to exclude from liability one who abducts slaves, as the slave is not a full-fledged Jew, and the other serves to exclude from liability one who abducts a person who is half slave and half free. Okay, new subject. The Gemara asks, from where is a prohibition against abducting a person derived? As so often the case, now we've been talking about the nuanced borderline cases, and only now are we going to ask the basic question. How do we know that it is prohibited under Torah law to kidnap a person, to abduct him, work him, and sell him into slavery? How do we know that's prohibited? The Torah doesn't say that explicitly. So Rabbi Yoshia says that it is derived from the verse, you shall not steal, at Exodus 20, verse 13. Does anybody know what Exodus 20, verse 13 lies smack dab in the middle of? The Ten Commandments, right? So in the Ten Commandments, it says, you shall not steal. They're saying that means you shall not abduct a person, exploit him for labor, and then sell him. Is that what you hear? Is that what you think when you hear you shall not steal? Why does that refer to abduction? Rabbi Yochanan says, actually, the prohibition on abducting a human is derived from the verse, they shall not be sold as slaves in Leviticus 25:42. And the Gemara comments, actually, they don't disagree, right? Rabbi Yoshia and Rabbi Yochanan, as each requires both verses to derive the prohibition. One sage, Rabbi Yoshia, enumerates the prohibition against abduction, actually taking a person, and the other sage, Rabbi Yochanan, enumerates the prohibition against selling the abductee into slavery. And both elements are required in order to trigger the death penalty for a person who violates this prohibition. And the sages taught in a Baraisa, you shall not steal, Exodus 20, verse 13. And it is with regard to one who abducts people that this verse is speaking. So now the Gemara challenges it. Do you say that the verse is speaking with regard to one who abducts people? Perhaps the verse is speaking only with regard to one who steals property, the way it sounds. You say, go out and learn from one of the 13 hermeneutical principles a matter derived from its context. With regard to what context are the adjacent prohibitions of you shall not kill and you shall not commit adultery, which are on either side of you shall not steal, in the Ten Commandments. And what are those prohibitions speaking about? They are speaking with regard to capital cases. So the Ten Commandments would not sandwich a non-capital offense between two capital offenses. You shall not kill, which is really you shall not murder. That is a death penalty offense, obviously. And we've seen so many times, you shall not commit adultery. That's a death penalty offense. So you shall not steal, which comes right in between, has to be referring to another death penalty offense. Is stealing property a death penalty offense? No. What kind of stealing is a death penalty offense? Abducting a person and selling him into slavery. It is taught in another brisa, you shall not steal, in Leviticus 19:11. This is with regard to one who steals property that the verse is speaking. So the Gemara challenges, do you say that the verse is speaking with regard to one who steals property? Maybe the verse is speaking only with regard to one who abducts people, like in the Ten Commandments. So you say, go out and learn from one of the 13 hermeneutical principles. A matter is derived from its context. With regard to what context is the subsequent verse, you shall neither exploit your neighbor nor rob him in Leviticus 19:13 speaking? It is speaking with regard to property. And so too over here where it says you shall not steal, it is talking about property. Of course it's prohibited to steal property, but it is not a death penalty offense. It was stated, if the witnesses to the abduction and the witnesses to the sale of a person were rendered conspiring witnesses, right? They were liars. They said that that Reuven, abducted Shimon and sold Shimon into slavery. But the witnesses turned out to be liars. How do we know they're liars? Because other witnesses came forward and said, well, these witnesses who claim that they saw Reuven abduct and then sell Shimon couldn't have seen that, because at the time and place when they claimed they saw that, we saw those witnesses in another city, blah, blah, blah. Right? So that's rendering them conspiring witnesses. And when witnesses are rendered conspiring witnesses, right, liars who conspire in order to have a defendant sentenced to some penalty, then generally speaking, the conspiring witnesses will be liable to the same penalty that the defendant would have been liable to if the testimony of the conspiring witnesses had been believed and established as truth in the court. So, it was stated, if the witnesses to the abduction and the witnesses to the sale of a person were rendered conspiring witnesses, Chizkiah says, the typical sentence of conspiring witnesses is not implemented and they are not executed. And Rabbi Yochanan says they are executed. So what are they arguing about? It is Chizkiah who said this statement in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who said, one derives from the verse, on the basis of two witnesses shall a matter be established, in Deuteronomy 19:15. And he derived from that the testimony of witnesses is valid only when they attest to an entire matter, but not to half a matter. And here, if you listen to precisely what the Gemara said, it was that there were witnesses to the abduction and there were witnesses to the sale of the abductee. And it's not the same pair of witnesses. There's at least 4 witnesses here. 2 saw Reuven abduct Shimon, and a different pair of witnesses saw Reuven sell Shimon into slavery. So both elements of the crime were witnessed, but they were 2 separate pairs of witnesses. Now, is it a death penalty offense to abduct someone and not sell them into slavery? No. Is it a death penalty offense to sell someone into slavery that is already in your custody, right, somehow? No, right? The only death penalty is if you both abduct and sell. So since each particular pair of witnesses only saw half of the transgression, if they were all rendered conspiring witnesses, Chizkiah would say they're exempt from the death penalty because neither one of them committed the full conspiratorial crime that would trigger the death penalty, right? Since each pair of witnesses provides testimony concerning only half the transgression for which the perpetrator would be liable, i.e., they each testify to only the abduction or the sale, the testimony of each pair is not valid. Therefore, when they are deemed conspiring witnesses, they are not executed. That's Chizkiah. And Rabbi Yochanan says his statement in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, who I think disagree with Rabbi Akiva, who said that one derives from the verse that the testimony is valid when they testify with regard to an entire matter, and even when they testify with regard to half a matter. Since the testimony of the 2 pairs of witnesses taken together, all 4 witnesses taken together, constitutes a complete testimony, if they are rendered conspiring witnesses, then they are all executed. And the Gemara notes, and Chizkiah concedes with regard to the final witnesses of a stubborn and rebellious son who were rendered conspiring witnesses, that they are executed. A stubborn and rebellious son is executed only if witnesses testified that he engaged in gluttonous and drunken conduct, and he was flogged, and then a second pair of witnesses testified that he again engaged in gluttonous and drunken conduct. His death sentence is based solely on the testimony of the second pair. As the first witnesses could say, and now on page 86b, it is in order to flog him, not to execute him, that we, the first pair of witnesses, came to court. These other witnesses, through their testimony, they are the ones who did this to him, brought the death penalty to him, or would have brought it if they were not found to be conspiring witnesses. Therefore, they are responsible for the entire matter of his execution and are therefore liable to be executed for giving conspiring testimony, if that is established. Rav Papa objects to this. If so, and Chizkiah concedes to Rabbi Yochanan in the case of the final testimony of the stubborn and rebellious son, let them also execute the witnesses to the sale of one who was abducted. As the witnesses to the abduction could say, it is in order to flog the abductor, not to execute him, that we came to the court as the first pair of witnesses. And if you would say that Chizkiah holds that one who abducts another and does not sell him is not flogged, that is difficult. But wasn't it stated with regard to the witnesses to the abduction, right, the first half of the crime, abduction and sale. So there were witnesses just to the abduction. With regard to them, and they are rendered conspiring witnesses prior to the testimony of the witnesses who saw the sale of the abductee. Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan disagree. One says that first pair of witnesses who conspire, about the abduction, they are flogged. And the other one says they are not flogged. And we say it may be concluded that it is Chizkiah who said they are flogged, even from the fact that Chizkiah said they are not executed. They're not executed, but they are flogged for conspiring to give false testimony that Reuven, for example, abducted Shimon, even without testimony regarding the sale. Now, since if one were to suggest that it is Rabbi Yochanan who said that they are flogged, that cannot be, since he says that conspiring witnesses are executed in this case. It is a prohibition that is given as a warning of liability for a court-imposed death penalty, and the principle is, with regard to any prohibition that is given as a warning of liability for a court-imposed death penalty, one is not flogged for its violation, even in a case where the transgressor is not executed, right? Because if death penalty applies, then even though there's a prohibition that's being violated, which normally would lead to flogging, since the death penalty applies, we would only apply the more stringent penalty, death, therefore not flogging. So even if on a technicality the defendant doesn't get the death penalty, the flogging does not then get put back. Since there were two penalties that applied for the same crime, death penalty because it was a death penalty offense, and flogging because there was a violation of a prohibition, and therefore flogging gets dismissed because we apply the more stringent penalty. And then even if the death penalty ends up not being applied, flogging is still off the table. The abductor is not flogged. So how then could the conspiring witnesses be flogged for testifying against him, as the punishment for conspiring witnesses is identical to the punishment of the one against whom they testified? Therefore, we're not following Rabbi Yochanan with this view. It has to be that Chizkiah, who holds that conspiring witnesses to the abduction are flogged. And therefore, everyone agrees that the conspiring witnesses to the sale are executed, right? One pair of witnesses testify they saw the abduction, and they turn out to be liars. The other pair of witnesses testify about the sale of the abductee, and they turn out to be liars. So sounds like we would execute the second pair of witnesses, but not the first, and there would be a disagreement about whether we flog the first, but we don't execute them. So rather, Rav Papa says the previous explanation is rejected, and instead the dispute should be explained as follows. With regard to the witnesses to the sale of the abductee, it is clear that everyone agrees that they are executed, as theirs is testimony concerning an entire matter, and would have led to the execution of the one they were conspiring against, who they claimed abducted and sold a person. Where the sages disagree, it is with regard to the witnesses to the abduction, the first pair. Chizkiah says they are not executed, as he holds that abduction stands discrete as an independent prohibition, which is punishable by lashes, and the sale stands discrete as a separate crime, and that is punishable by strangulation. Rabbi Yochanan says they are executed. The first pair is also executed. Why? Because the abduction is the beginning of the process that culminates with the sale. The witnesses testifying to the abduction are testifying to a transgression that will culminate with the sale of the abductee, and that is a death penalty offense. The Gemara notes, and Rabbi Yochanan concedes with regard to the initial witnesses concerning a stubborn and rebellious son who testified that he engaged in gluttonous and drunken conduct and who were rendered conspiring witnesses, that they would not be executed, because they could say it is in order to flog him for past conduct, not to execute him for actions he might perform in the future, that we came to court. Therefore, there is no connection between their testimony and punishment for future actions, as opposed to these two pairs of witnesses in the case of abduction. Abaye said, in summary, to help us remember, all concede in the case of the stubborn and rebellious son, all concede in the case of the stubborn and rebellious son, and there is a dispute with regard to a stubborn and rebellious son. What does he mean? With regard to the initial witnesses, all concede, even Rabbi Yochanan, that in the case of the stubborn and rebellious son, they are not witnesses, they are not executed if the witnesses are rendered conspiring witnesses, because they could say it was in order to flog him for past conduct, not to execute him, that we came to court. No one argues that. And with regard to the final witnesses, all, even Chizkiah, concede in the case of the stubborn and rebellious son, that they would be executed if they are rendered conspiring witnesses, due to the fact that the initial witnesses could say, we testified just to have him flogged, not for future events. But the second pair of witnesses can't make that claim when they came and testified falsely about the final act that would render the stubborn and rebellious son liable to the death penalty. If they were liars, then they are going to be executed. The witnesses, the conspiring witnesses, would be liable to execution. But where is the dispute? It is with regard to a stubborn and rebellious son in a case where two of the final witnesses who testify after the son was already flogged for engaging in gluttonous and drunken conduct, that they, and these witnesses come and say, he stole in our presence. But two other witnesses come and say, he ate in our presence. And since for the stubborn and rebellious son, the two elements for the final straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak, is that the stubborn and rebellious son stole the food or the money that he used to buy the food, that then he, engaged in gluttonous and drunken conduct. He had to both steal it and, overeat in this ridiculous way. Remember, the stubborn and rebellious son, that's never, ever in Jewish history been actually carried out, but we study the law to understand its principles. And under those principles, the final stage of the crime requires stealing and gluttony together. Well, if one pair of witnesses testified to the stealing and a different pair of witnesses testified to the gluttony, and all four of them were rendered conspiring witnesses, would they all be executed? Or could each one say, we only testified to half a matter, and therefore we're not subject to the death penalty even for our conspiring testimony? Rav Asi says the witnesses to the sale of a person who were rendered conspiring witnesses are not executed due to the fact that the one against whom they testified could say, although they testified that I sold an individual, it was my slave that I sold. I had a right to sell him. In that case, the witnesses are not testifying that he violated capital transgression, as they cannot attest to the fact that the individual he sold was first abducted. And Rav Yosef says, in accordance with whose opinion is that halacha of Rav Asi, it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who says the testimony of witnesses is valid only when they attest to an entire matter and not to half a matter. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, according to your explanation, it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, as if it were in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, who hold the testimony is valid when they testify to an entire matter and even when they testify to half a matter. Are the conspiring witnesses executed? Doesn't Rav Asi say that they are not executed due to the fact that the one against whom they testified could say, although they testified that I sold an individual, it was my slave that I sold, right? There's only half a matter, and the half of the matter that they could testify about was innocent because slavery was legal then. So according to that reasoning, even the rabbis would concede that they are not executed. So rather, you may even say that Rav Asi's statement is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. And it's concerning a case where only witnesses to the sale came to testify, and witnesses to the abduction did not testify. In that case, the accused can avoid punishment. Therefore, the conspiring witnesses are not executed. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, what is the purpose of stating the law? Obviously, in that case, they're not executed, as there's no way to determine that the one he sold is not a slave. Therefore, the defendant was not subject to the death penalty, and why would the conspiring witnesses be subject to a death penalty? And the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary to teach that they are not executed, even if witnesses to the abduction ultimately came after the witnesses to the sale had testified, and testified he sold a free man, not a slave. Right? If the testimonies were reversed chronologically, and the ones who testified about the abduction only testified later, after the ones who testified about the sale, still, it seems there would not be liability for the conspiring witnesses to the death penalty. And the Gemara asks, but still, what is the purpose of stating that law? When the witnesses to the sale testified, their testimony was not sufficient to execute the accused. And the Gemara answers, well, no, it is necessary to teach the law in a very specialized case where they are not executed, even where the first and second pairs of witnesses were both present. So even though the witnesses about the sale testified before the witnesses about the abduction, the witnesses about the abduction were in the courtroom when the witnesses about the sale were testifying. And we see that there's some hand gestures passing between them, right? Indicating that the conspiring witnesses to the sale were aware that the witnesses to the abduction would follow, and that therefore the initial witnesses are part of the conspiracy to testify and execute the accused. And consequently, it is necessary to teach this law, lest you say gesturing is a significant matter. And the legal status of the two testimonies is that of a single testimony. Therefore, Rav Asi teaches us that gesturing like this is not significant and would not lead to a death penalty for the conspiring witnesses. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 10. Now Mishnah number 4. A rebellious elder. Very different. The stubborn and rebellious son, was so difficult to define and to meet the requirements for the elements of that crime. It never happened in Jewish history, even though it's spelled out in the Torah. Now we're going to talk about a rebellious elder. That is someone who has authority, is looked at as an authority by the Jewish community, and who disagrees with a ruling of the Sanhedrin, or let's say the elders of the generation, the majority of the rabbis of the generation. And he says, no, you're all wrong. And he teaches his view to the people and incites them to follow his views of the law, which contradict the views of the majority of the sages in that generation. And we know that the sages don't keep changing the law in every generation. They respect the precedents of earlier generations. But when a new question comes up, we bring together the great sages of the generation, they vote, and then they establish the law. Now, if somebody doesn't hold by that, and he incites people to follow his own views of the law and not the halacha that's been established by the sages, well, then we have a real problem. Because, obviously that now Jews are being told to sin. Because since the majority established the law, and here comes somebody under color of being a sage or an elder or rabbi teaching people to do different than what the law holds, this would be a very big problem for the Jewish people. And that's why the Torah does say explicitly that such a person would be subject to the death penalty. So that's what we're talking about. A rebellious elder, according to the court, who does not observe the ruling of the court, is executed by strangulation, as it is stated. If there shall be a matter too hard for you in judgment, and you shall arise and ascend unto the place that the Lord your God shall choose, and you shall do according to the matter that they shall declare unto you. That's the majority of the sages who vote in that generation. And the man that shall do so intentionally, not to listen, that man shall die. That's Deuteronomy 17, verses 8 through 12. So there were 3 courts there in Jerusalem. sort of like the Supreme, the Superior Court, the Court of Appeals, and Supreme Court. Just, that's not what they were called at all, but just to help us understand 3 levels of court that met in Jerusalem. One convenes at the entrance to the Temple Mount. The second convenes at the entrance to the Temple Courtyard. And the third one, the Great Sanhedrin, convenes in the chamber of hewn stone. I'm almost done, by the way, so questions or comments, please get them in now. An elder who issues a ruling contrary to the ruling of his colleagues, and his colleagues come to that court that is at the entrance to the Temple Mount, and the elder says, this is what I interpreted, and this is what my colleagues interpreted. This is what I taught, and that is what my colleagues taught. So if the members of the court heard a clear halachic ruling in that case, the court says it to them. And if not, they come to those judges who are convened at the entrance of the temple courtyard, higher court. And the elder says, this is what I interpreted, and that is what my colleagues interpreted. This is what I taught, and that is what my colleagues taught. So the members of the court heard a clear halachic ruling in that case, the court says it to them. And if not, these judges and those judges come to the highest court, the Sanhedrin of 71 judges that meets in the chamber of hewn stone, from which Torah emerges to the entire Jewish people. As it is stated, quote, "Then you shall do according to the matter that they shall declare unto you from that place that the Lord shall choose, and you shall observe to perform according to all that they shall teach you." Deuteronomy 17:10. They are the ultimate arbiters who establish the law, the halacha, that is binding on the Jewish people. If they ruled contrary to the ruling of the elder, and the elder then returned to his city, and nevertheless he taught in the manner that he was teaching previously, he is exempt from punishment. Right? If he keeps teaching his view, which contradicts the views that have established law of the Sanhedrin in that generation, he's not subject to the death penalty. He's exempt. But if he instructed others to act on the basis of his ruling, right, inciting them to action in contradiction to the halacha, rather they should follow his view, and he's telling them to act that way, not just, hey, this is what the Sanhedrin said and this is what I say. He can teach his minority view. But if he incites others to act according to his minority contradictory view, then he is liable to be executed. As it is stated, and the man that shall do so intentionally not to listen, he shall be put to death. Meaning that one is not liable unless he instructs others to act. A student who is not yet an elder, i.e. he has not been ordained, who instructs others to act contrary to the ruling of the Sanhedrin, he is exempt, even if he instructs. As a ruling given prior to ordination is not a valid ruling, so his ruling is meaningless. It follows that his stringency is his leniency. The stringency imposed upon the student is that he is not sanctioned to issue rulings. But this results in a leniency that if he does instruct others to act on the basis of his ruling that is contrary to the ruling of the Sanhedrin, he is exempt because his ruling is meaningless and would not qualify him to be liable for the death penalty. That's the Mishna. Tomorrow, God willing, we'll pick it up on page 87a with the Gemara of that Mishnah. I'll just mention slightly, I'm not really concerned at all, but I'll just mention we're remixing the movie tomorrow because there's been updates to the credits and I'm adding a video and stuff like that. So I'm going to be, about half an hour away from my house. That should be from 2 to 4. And I should have all the time in the world to get back and teach our class on time tomorrow. If some kind of a crisis emerges in that session, please God it shouldn't, we'll either delay the class by half an hour or an hour if necessary, or take other measures. So if I don't come on the air at 6 p.m. Pacific tomorrow, check Accidental Talmudist Facebook page, and we'll announce if there's any change to the schedule. Okay, Joe Branson asked, would an English equivalent to be John Doe for Ben Plony? And Sharon said, it's actually more like Mr. So-and-so. Yeah, good answer. And Sharon says, my understanding that kidnapping is in the Ten Commandments. Ray, stealing is kidnapping then defined as abduction and getting money either by sale of the abductee or ransom for their return. Now that's interesting, Sharon, right? Ransom for their return is how we normally think of kidnapping. But no one has said anything about ransom. That has not been mentioned. That sounds like a different crime, a heinous crime, but not a death penalty offense. All we've heard here in chapter 10 is that the death penalty offense, kidnapping, as defined in the Torah, and what it means when it says thou shalt not steal in the Ten Commandments, is abducting a person, exploiting them, working them in some way, and then selling them into slavery, right? Which, by the way, my understanding is that's what happened in much of the slave trade, please God, it shouldn't happen in the modern world. I guess it still does. There is human trafficking. But even the North American slave trade that led to the tragic abomination of slavery in America, right? It wasn't so much that the slavers, went into the continent of Africa, and just grabbed people and threw them on the ship. What I've read is that there were tribes there in Africa who, would be at war with each other, and then one side would win, capture a bunch of people, and then take those prisoners of war and sell them, to these European slavers who would then take the slaves to America. Now, those tribes aren't subject to Torah law. They're not Jews. But if they were, then that would certainly be this crime, right? Of abducting a person, abducting your fellow, and then selling him into slavery. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, for page 87. Please God, it should be at the regular time. All the best.